Good evening, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is David Klemp, and I'm the Air Quality Bureau Chief. And thank you very much for providing us this opportunity to address your subcommittee. First of all, I want to echo a lot of the things that Ms. Nowakowski stated about process. And I want to go back a little further than last July, because the department's really been engaged in a very rigorous process since the draft rule came out. And what I want to leave you with is a sense, and I'll say this repeatedly, at least some of the principles in support of this sense, that the process that we employ in the development of this plan is every bit as important as the plan we develop. It's very important. You can see the folks in the room, the folks around the table that are here of their own volition. We know that this is a topic that is of vital importance to many in the state of Montana, and we very much appreciate that. So really the department started a very rigorous stakeholder process as soon as the draft rule came out. Some of the folks around the table in this room were part of some community meetings that the department, along with the governor's office, formed and reached out. And the purpose of those meetings is very similar to what we're going to do here today. It's to provide somewhat of an education or a common understanding of some of the technical elements that will be part of any plan. But more importantly, we wanted to engage those folks that might be affected by this. And so the focus of that initial outreach was to help us inform our comments that we would then submit to the Environmental Protection Agency, because that was a draft rule. Shortly after we submitted our comments, which was last December, there was a legislative session, so we took a brief hiatus a little bit from the process of engaging all of the stakeholders. But shortly after the session ended, we picked it up again with a lot of rigor. And I want to bring everybody in the room, along with those at the table, up to speed with what we had proposed to do under the draft rule and where we think we need to go under the final rule. I don't think it's at all a wasted effort to talk about the draft rule, because even though the rule has changed substantially, to some of us, it may feel like a more traditional air quality rule now than maybe the draft rule did. It is very different, but yet a lot of the things that we were working towards with the draft rule are directly transferable to the final rule. And hopefully I can explain that clearly enough. So when we went out to communities and engaged a lot of stakeholders, I mean, this clearly was above the department level. This was something the governor's office was very interested in hearing from folks on. And so the governor's office was also part of the Sage Grouse, and there was an advisory council, and they had learned some very valuable lessons as to how to come up with some recommendations on a plan on some very contentious issues. And so a lot of this stuff originally was modeled after the Sage Grouse Council that some of you are probably very familiar with. But rather than go and come up with the design of a stakeholder process, what we wanted to do was identify a very comprehensive list of stakeholders and conduct an interview of those stakeholders and hear from the stakeholders as to what they believed was the appropriate process, what concerns they had. And Ms. Nowakowski is correct. We wanted a third-party, very objective entity to conduct those interviews. They were going to be asking questions about how they felt about the department's role and the governor's office role, and you can imagine it's much better to have a non-department person asking those questions to get the most objective responses possible. So before I tell you exactly what it was, I want to tell you the types of folks that we contacted. It was a very broad group. It consisted of legislators, a public service commissioner, some of the co-ops, utilities, labor representatives, owners of affected electric generating units, conservation groups, tribes, educational institutions, coal mine representatives, transmission organizations, renewable energy representatives, local government, the Chamber of Commerce, and members of the Main Street Montana Project Energy Key Industry Network. There's roughly 30 to 35 folks that were identified as going to be contacted to help design this interview process. We put a goal, we identified a goal, and the goal was to identify these stakeholders, conduct these interviews, and receive their feedback as to how to best organize and carry out an effective stakeholder process that would provide recommendations to the governor's office, to the agency, on a plan that could be developed to comply. And again, recall this was under the draft rule, and we'll talk a little bit later about how that draft rule has changed. So the Center for New Energy Economy, it's an entity that's located out of Colorado State University. For the better part of the last year, they have been convening virtually all of the western states around 111D topics. They've brought utilities and public service commissioners and PSC staff and members of environmental agencies, regulatory agencies, energy offices, EPA folks, and provided a lot of education, and they have some pretty significant expertise. So we were very comfortable with having them conduct the interviews. We did not know who was going to facilitate this process. That was going to be determined later. So here's the concept, basically, that was floated to the folks that were interviewed, is that the governor would form a broad-based Clean Power Plan Advisory Committee with representatives from key stakeholder groups, and that group would function very much like you all function and appoint their chairs. The advisory group, and this is vitally important for us, needed to be run as an open, transparent, and very, very public process. Ms. Nowakowski mentioned this, but it's worth repeating. The folks that were interviewed weren't necessarily the folks that would apply for and be appointed to that governor's advisory council. And that's the part that maybe has changed more than anything else from the draft to the final rule that I'll go over here in a minute. Essentially, that advisory committee would be charged with making recommendations to the agency regarding options for a plan that would comply with the Clean Power Plan. And it was generally thought that the advisory council may come up with up to 3 recommendations, for consideration. And I won't get too far into what the draft rule was, or how it was constructed. But there were essentially 4 building blocks in the establishment of the target of the under the draft rule. And it was very broad in its impact, as well as some of its consequences. And so I think it was pretty well understood that this advisory council, to make it functional, would be around 10 to 12 members. And it would be a lot to expect of 10 to 12 folks to have all of the expertise that was necessary to talk about all of the issues that would come up under the development of the recommendations. So there was going to be, I believe, a lot of opportunity for folks who did not sit on the council to be supportive of the council and work with the council through the formation of some subgroups around some various topics. And that may still very much be applicable, as we move forward. And then that advisory committee would be jointly staffed and organized and facilitated by the DEQ and a third-party facilitator, maybe like the Center for New Energy Economy, if that's where we ended up. A little bit about the timeline, because we're really right on the timeline that we thought, where we thought we would be. Mid-July of this year, the center would conduct their interviews. And aside from an interview or 2, I believe they have pretty well completed all of the interviews that they contemplate doing. By mid-August, they would summarize the stakeholder input for the agency as well as for the governor's office. And I have met with the center as well as Mr. Baker and I have met with the center, and we've got a report out, and I'll let you know kind of what the high points of that are. And then under the draft plan in early September, we thought that the governor may call for some applications for folks to serve on the advisory committee. And that's kind of where we're at today. The idea was in October, the advisory committee would be appointed, and then late October, early November, the advisory council would meet and decide how often they're going to meet, how they're going to run, who's going to chair what, and then meet on a fairly frequent basis. So the timeline for that advisory council, as contemplated in the draft, and it still holds today, was it would operate under the idea that it would need to come up with some recommendations for the very first submittal that was due to EPA. Under the draft rule, the first submittal that was due to EPA was in September of 2016. And there were some options for some extensions that were given. Under the final rule, our very first submittal is still due to EPA in September of 2016. Now, what that submittal is and what it does is different a little bit. But that is still the idea moving forward with this advisory council, that we would look at this one step at a time, because there's a longer timeline for the development of the plan. We want to make sure engage in a very robust process, and we want to tackle this one step at a time. Essentially, for the 2016 submittal, we need to identify some of the compliance options that we're considering. We need to make a demonstration that we're undertaking very meaningful public comment. So under the draft rule, we thought it was very appropriate and necessary. Under the final rule, we think it's very appropriate and necessary. And oh, by the way, it's required also that we undertake meaningful stakeholder involvement in the development of this plan, which is a good thing. We need to decide whether or not we're going to participate in the Clean Energy Incentive Program, which is essentially early action on energy efficiency. And that this initial submittal is in no way binding. It is intended to give folks, maybe other states, entities within our state, an idea of what we're considering as we move forward. And this submittal could also, it's a couple things. It could be a final submittal, or it could be a request for an extension for a couple years. So after the interviews were completed, there were a couple things that I gleaned that I think are very worth noting. Those interviewed indicated a strong, very strong support. I believe it was nearly unanimous support for this type of process. They did identify some of the challenges, and I think we're going to uncover some of those challenges as we talk today. And that challenge is, how do we develop a common technical understanding of this without getting into too much detail, too far into the weeds? There's a lot of opportunity for rabbit trails or some other distractions. And so everything is very, very important to a lot of people, but we certainly don't have the ability to, look at everything to the same extent. The interviews also changed, at least the tone of the interviews changed from those that were interviewed prior to the release of the final rule to those that were interviewed after the release of the final rule. Because the final rule did change quite a bit, and we're going to talk a little bit. I've asked Craig Hendrickson to give you a presentation and kind of compare and contrast where we are with the draft and the final rule. I think it's very important that we spend a little bit of time on the draft rule, only because that's where a lot of us, maybe a lot of you, have gained your prior knowledge on this topic, and that's how folks are looking at it. And we want to make sure that we, certainly acknowledge that and maybe focus more on the final rule. But until we talk about where some of the changes were, we're not going to be able to successfully do that. So we're still anticipating that this advisory council will be formed. Again, because the rule has changed, even if it is maybe a more traditional air quality rule, probably understand that there might be some delays, at least in establishment of that council, so that we have time to more fully digest some of the complexities of the rule. Every day that goes by, we're learning something new, and that won't change in the months to come. Maybe some of the biggest changes might be who sits on the advisory council, because certainly some of the impacts, depending on some of the choices that are made in the final rule, may change who sits at the table. I want to make sure I covered everything. So, Mr. Chairman, with that's what was contemplated under the draft Clean Power Plan for purposes of 111D. There's other rules in play. This is where we are today. We're right now sitting right where we thought we would be, but I think we're not going to end up being able to get some stuff done early because the final rule did change quite a bit. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I will sit down, and if you have any questions, I'll be more than happy to try to answer them.
Thank you. Before we take questions from the committee, under the rules of the interim committee, we'll ask for public comment. I see the big crowd out there, and please don't repeat yourself. Please make it as brief as possible. I would like you to comment on now. You might have been interviewed before. I think what the interest of the committee is how you see what process should go forward. If there would be some discussion on that, I think it'd be helpful to the committee. So with that, I'll open it up for public comment. Questions from the committee? Representative Senator Ankney.
Mr. Chairman, question for Mr. Klemp.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Ankney.
A little bit, so with the formation of the Governor's Advisory Group and the this joint EQC ETIC committee, who's going to make the final recommendation? I mean, is it going to be the governor's recommendation, or is it going to be we take the information the advisory group gets and this subcommittee goes through that and makes the final decision? Do you see in the master plan, where's this recommendation going to come from?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Ankney, there's a couple things in there. The section of the Federal Clean Air Act that this rule is being promulgated under contemplates a plan that is submitted by the governor of each state. So the governor will be submitting a plan. They're required by the Federal Clean Air Act to do that. Now, the idea behind this advisory council or any stakeholder process we have is to try to get the best recommendations possible on ways to implement a final plan. So the recommendations that the governor ultimately goes with may come from the advisory council. It may come from a legislative subcommittee, individual legislators. It may come from folks who stop by, our office and come up with some ideas. I don't know that if it doesn't come from the advisory council, I wouldn't say that it wouldn't be considered. I think all ideas, all options are on the table. All good ideas are being considered right now, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Ankney, other question? Other questions? Any other questions? Senator Smith.
Mr. Chairman, I have a question for Mr. Kemp.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Smith.
It seems to me that just recently I read that the Supreme Court had said that the EPA was overextending on this rule. And I wanted to know what the opinion was of your department as to is this going to be put on hold? Is the federal government just kind of ignoring the Supreme Court's decision, or what's going on? It looks like we're kind of in a period of litigation on this right now.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Smith, I'm not aware of any opinion that the Supreme Court has on the Clean Power Plan or specifically the 111D rule. The Supreme Court did weigh in on the greenhouse gas tailoring rule. I'm not sure if that's what you're referring to, where they talked that EPA did not have the authority to essentially establish a higher threshold for permitting for carbon dioxide than it did for traditional pollutants. So until such time, I mean, there have been a number of states that have filed in court to put a stay on this rule until such time as the courts weigh in. And that, in the last couple days, was ruled as premature. Essentially how it works is when this rule is published in the Federal Register, which we're understanding will happen sometime in October, that will involve a 60-day time frame for folks to file litigation on that. And I would imagine some of the litigation will be to put a stay on this until the courts have ruled. Whether or not that's successful or not, I'm not sure.
Mr. Klemp, what it means for Montana.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, once again, David Klemp, DEQ. In this particular session, we were kind of asked to focus on the technical aspects of this rule. And with the chairman's permission, I'd like to have a couple staff speak to you. What I wanted to make available to this subcommittee are the true subject matter experts on this to hopefully hit this presentation at the right level and answer a lot of the questions that folks may have moving forward. And again, with your permission, Mr. Chair, I'd like to do two things first, or two things. First and foremost, I would like Rebecca Harbage, who's a senior air quality planner within our program, talk to you a little bit about the timeframes for compliance. I think it's very important that the subcommittee understand the timeframes that we're working under. After Rebecca presents, I've asked Craig Henriksen, a senior engineer with the department, to compare and contrast the draft and final rule and hopefully give you all a very solid technical understanding of what we're seeing in terms of what the implications are for this rule. So again, I hope we hit it at the right level, and I would like to leave a couple points with the subcommittee, to remember. It's early. It's been a month. I know folks really want a lot of answers, and it's going to be some time. We know, we have staff engaged in this. It's 1,560 some odd pages. That doesn't count the technical support documents that get into the great detail. We're looking at thousands of pages. And it's one thing to read those pages. It's another thing to understand all the nuances associated with all of those things. So please understand that a month from now, we're going to understand things hopefully better and maybe a little differently than we do today. Also, it's really important not to just focus on the final number. And if you heard me speak on the draft rule, you heard me say the same thing. It's not just about the final number. It's how that number was established, and maybe more importantly, what are some of the options moving forward for complying with that number? So we need to keep all of that in context. We're keeping all compliance options on the table. I'm not here today, we're not here today to present you with a path forward. Again, we believe that we need to engage stakeholders and listen to folks before we come up with an idea for a path forward, and that we're going to do the best we can for this state. So, Mr. Chairman, if it's all right with you, I'd like Ms. Harbage to talk to you a little bit about the timeline first.
Yes, that'd be great.
Thank you.
Ms. Harvey.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Rebecca Harbage, and for the record, that's H-A-R-B-A-G-E. And as Dave Klemp said, I'm an environmental planner with the Department of Environmental Quality's Air Quality Bureau. And before I start, I just wanted to echo what Dave said earlier and thanking you all for inviting us to be here today to present some of these more technical aspects. We got the fun job of reading the 1,560 pages, so we could hopefully summarize some of that for you and help with the decision making here today. And what I hope to do, as Dave was talking about, is give you a little bit of context in terms of the regulatory timelines and the regulatory process that I really think is sort of the foundation or the bones behind the state process that Dave described to you earlier that we'll take as Montana. And I do have a handout, if I could distribute that. I'll let that work its way around. Okay, now that you all have it in front of you, really what I want to do is start at the end because I think the very important deadlines you'll note are, as you can see, the interim compliance period beginning in 2022 and the final compliance in 2030. And so the way my mind works is I like to get a sense of the timeline that we have before I get into really the nitty-gritty details of what we need to do in that timeline. So just compared to the draft rule, EPA did push the start of the interim period back 2 years from 2020 in the draft to 2022 in the final rule. Their intention being to give states and power plants more time to come into compliance with the rule. So now jumping back toward the beginning of that handout, despite the fact that we have 7 years before the compliance period begins, you'll see that we do need to make some decisions in the next couple of years about how we'll get to that final compliance. So as you can see on the handout, the final rule requires that we submit a state plan by next September or a request for a 2-year extension through 2018. And the stakeholder process, as Dave described, will really inform exactly what we end up submitting next September. So we do, according to the final rule, need to submit something. And keeping in mind with any of these dates on the handout, any submittal to EPA does require a 30-day public comment period in advance of that submittal. So when I say something is due next September, that's really August in order to get that public comment before we submit. In terms of the request for an extension, in the final rule, EPA allows a number of different reasons that states may be granted an extension. These include things like the timing of legislative sessions or the need for additional time to make sure we're being very transparent in our decision making to make sure we're involving all of the key stakeholders and all of the affected parties to the right degree. It's important to note also that if we do request an extension, the final, no final decisions would be required by next fall. And anything that we do submit in that request for an extension would be non-binding. So if we wanted to extend our stakeholder involvement process and we changed our minds along that way, we could change what we submitted to EPA next fall. Moving along the timeline, if we are granted an extension next fall, we would then be required to submit a progress report to EPA in 2017, so 2 years from now. And at that time, EPA will require that states commit to some sort of a plan approach and provide more of a firm roadmap for completing a final state plan. A state that receives an extension, as I said, has until September of 2018 then to submit their final state plan. But that doesn't mean that they couldn't submit it at any time up to that September 2018 date. And then if a state fails to submit a state plan or a request for extension or progress report by the deadlines you see on this handout that are in the final rule, our understanding is, as with other 111D regulations, that EPA would then publish a federal plan for that state. Wrapping up, the final piece of the framework that you see on your handout is what has been mentioned earlier today, the Clean Energy Incentive Program. Much of the detail of that program is still proposed, not final. EPA proposed a lot of that language with their proposed federal plan, which is still out for public comment, or as soon as it's published in the Federal Register will be available for public comment. And what that program really is a way for states to earn credit for actions that they take before the compliance period begins. So you'll see on your handout, it kind of starts around 2016 and then extends up to the beginning of that interim compliance period. And 2 types of early action projects can earn quote unquote bonus credits from EPA or allowances from EPA. The first type being renewable energy development, and the second being energy efficiency projects, specifically in low-income communities. The reason it's important to mention here, and I included it on the handout, is that states that intend to participate in that early action program are required to say so in their state plan or to indicate their preliminary intention to participate in early action when they submit their request for extension. So that would mean if we think we might want to participate in this clean energy incentive program, we would want to indicate that by next fall. So with that, I think at this point in the evening, I've probably said enough, Mr. Chairman. If you have any questions for me, I will be available to answer them.
We'll go with the other presentation, then we'll ask for questions.
Good. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Craig Henriksen, Air Quality Engineer. I also have a handout if I could make it available to the committee. And I've also got some handouts for the audience as well. I'm going to try to stay focused on the technical issues. I think we all have personal issues that go kind of along with the Clean Power Plan. I'm a Montana native, so I certainly know the history of Montana's energy mix here. But I want to again thank you for inviting DEQ. I drew the straw for the technical talk here, so I'll try to keep this brief. I've got about 10 handouts that I want to go through. So as we've talked, there are very few things in the final plan that actually line up with the draft plan. Fortunately, there still is this thing called an EGU. That still exists in the final plan. EPA changed it up a little bit. There are basically two categories where a best system of emission reduction is established. So both for our coal-fired EGUs and what EPA calls natural gas combined cycle units. Today, for simplicity, I'm just going to call them affected gas units. So for each of those two categories of EGUs, EPA basically has put forward these affected units that we're going to talk about today. And then based on those emission rates, which they calculated for each of those two categories, they basically did a weighted average and came up with essentially a BSER, a target for each state that really represents the BSER for those two categories. Of course, we're talking about affected units in Montana. We know we're talking about coal-fired EGUs. Montana actually does not have any gas-fired plants that are covered under this Clean Power Plan. So it really is just our 9 affected units that we had based on the baseline. Of course, we all know that the Corette facility shut down this year, so we're really only talking about 8 affected units spread across 5 facilities going forward. Those are the only plants that fall under this Clean Power Plan as affected units. To talk about a little bit how EPA changed the approach in the final plan versus the draft. Certainly in the draft rule, they looked at the specifics of each of the EGUs in Montana and basically looked at their emission rate and basically determined that each one of those units should be able to do a heat rate improvement. Rather than follow that same approach in the final rule, they basically rolled up all of the units into a regional analysis and determined what kind of on a regional basis what each of those technologies, the coal-fired EGUs and the gas units, should be able to do for an emission rate. So it was a completely different approach. They recognized, EPA was trying to recognize that that electricity does not stop at the border of Montana. Basically, it flows into a grid, into a region, and so that's why they changed that part of the approach. The other thing that Dave mentioned is in the original, there were 4 building blocks. We certainly know we had the heat rate improvements. Building block 2 was dispatch from our coal-fired EGUs to the gas units. Building block 3, of course, was the renewable development, and building block 4 was the energy efficiency. In the final rule, they basically took away the energy efficiency in terms of calculating the BSER. So that got dropped off of the rule, and they based the emission rates for the coal-fired EGUs and the gas-fired units based on just the 3 building blocks without EE. So that's a pretty significant change in the final rule. In terms of where it left us, I mean, I'm sure you all remember when we put out the white paper, we had some targets out there. Across the nation, the state goals as a rate basis were from 215 to 1,783 pounds per megawatt hour, a very wide range, and that was one of the biggest complaints that EPA got, was it was so different for each of the states. When they did the regional analysis, the low became a little higher and the high came down, so the range got much tighter, and now you end up with a range for all the states between 771 up to 1305. The other important thing to mention with the draft versus the final, the draft rule only had a rate-based target. It talked a little bit about how you might get to some sort of mass target for each of the states, but it was never finalized. It was just kind of as an example. Well, in the final rule, again, probably based on a lot of the comments that were received, they actually came up with a mass-based target for each of the states as well as a rate-based target. So that's a pretty big difference as well. slide 5 there, there's handout 5 there. Again, I mentioned the regional analysis. A couple things happened. A lot of the folks that commented on the draft rule, including DEQ, Governor's Office, PSC, we certainly recognized that 2012 was not a typical year for Montana. There was a lot of hydro that year. There was probably some recession going on. There was a lot of things that were going on. EPA did bump up Montana's baseline level by 7%, which effectively helped us a little bit. So we started a little higher, so when they applied the BSER, it didn't take us quite down as low as it would have otherwise. So that was one of the things that EPA did address. In terms of the building blocks, there's really an order of how they did that. They still assume that there are heat rate improvements that need to happen at our coal-fired EGUs. The second thing that they did was they assumed that all of the renewable energy growth that's going to happen going forward is basically going to displace coal-fired generation and gas generation. So it's a dispatch from those EGUs being taken up by renewable energy. And then the final step that they did in the BSER was then to assume that the gas-fired EGUs are going to take production away from the remaining coal-fired EGUs. So those were really the 3 steps that they used in terms of using the building blocks to come up with the rates. So where did that leave us? I mean, certainly, again, the white paper and all the draft stuff had us at 1,771 pounds per megawatt hour as a rate. We all know now that our 2030 rate in the final rule is 1,305, which again is equivalent to the emission rate established for coal-fired EGUs. Because Montana does not have any gas-fired EGUs, our target by default became equal to the emission rate established as this part of this BSER as 1305. And then the mass target that they determined to be equivalent to that rate is this 11.3 million tons for affected units. Just a little bit more on rates. The other thing that's important to understand is we not only have the final rate in 2030 and beyond, and the 11.3 in 2030 and beyond, but there is this interim period from 2022 to 2029, this 8-year period, where over that period we also have to meet an average rate. The flexibility, though, is we get to choose how we meet it during that 8-year period. And so we think there's some flexibility in terms of maybe doing some front loading at the front end of that 8-year period. You can do some different things so long as when you get to the end of that 8-year period, over that period you've met that either that average rate or that average mass. So we see that as some flexibility that we want to really talk about with stakeholders on. So clearly EPA is giving us an option to either go rate or mass, and that's a big question out there. If we go rate, and they've introduced a new topic here called ERCs, emission rate credits. And so what those are is that's where the renewable energy and the demand side energy, the avoidance stuff, you're going to generate basically a credit that's a megawatt hour. And what you're going to do is you're going to add that into the denominator of the rate-based equation. And it ends up driving down your overall calculated rate for those EGUs. And so that's kind of the key with rate-based. With mass-based, essentially each of the EGUs would have an allowance of CO2 credits, tons of CO2 credits. And so if a given EGU does not have enough credits, it needs to go out and would need to find some somewhere else if it wanted to have higher output at its given facility. And so really that's a big decision right up front, because both if you want to trade with a state, you essentially both states have to be on rate or both states have to be on mass. You can't really mix it real easily. So figuring out if we would need to partner with somebody is going to be key at some point in this process. One of their slides I have in here is just to kind of bring us back to reality. Slide 9 there. I'm showing some 2002 adjusted tons for each of our 9 affected units. And so what I've done there is I've taken those units up by the 7%. assuming that's what they would have produced at if we didn't have such a good hydro year. And so you'd see we're at 19.2 million tons for 2012. So we know we would need to go from there somehow down to 11.3 by the end of the period. Certainly a challenging opportunity for all of us to work together on. The last two handouts I'm not really going to talk about. Number 10 really is just showing how each of the states fared in terms of the rate change from draft to final. And then the last slide is really just an example of how the 1305 was actually calculated for Montana. So, Mr. Chairman, with that, I'm available for questions, and if I can't answer any, we brought all of our DEQ white paper team members here that certainly can help me. Thank you.